Imagine your home is gone, just burned to the ground. The absolute last thing you want to hear is that it could be years before you can rebuild. But that was the harsh reality for thousands of families in Los Angeles after the huge wildfires in 2025. Today, we're going to break down a really controversial executive order that promised to change all that. So, was it a desperately needed lifeline or a really risky shortcut? Let's get into it. So this all starts with the massive 2025 Pacific Palisades and Eaton Canyon wildfires. And to give you a sense of just how big this was, look at this number. We're talking 40,000 acres scorched. I mean, that is just an immense, immense area of devastation. And that number, 40,000 acres, what does that actually mean for people on the ground? Well, it translates to over 16,000 structures. We're talking homes, businesses, pretty much entire neighborhoods wiped out. Thousands of families were left with absolutely nothing. Okay, so fast forward one full year. Imagine you're still waiting, living somewhere temporary, surrounded by these constant reminders of everything you've lost. And you see that fewer than a dozen of your neighbors have actually managed to fully rebuild. That number right there, it isn't just a statistic. It's a symbol of a recovery effort that had basically ground to a halt. So what was the holdup, right? Well, the federal aid money was actually there. It had been approved. The problem was the paperwork. There was a 93-day average wait just for a building permit. That meant 3 out of every 4 families were just stuck in limbo, living in temporary housing with no clear idea of when or even if they could go home. So with everything at a standstill, the federal government decided to step in. On January 23rd, 2026, President Trump signed an executive order. The White House positioned this as a direct move to slice through what they were calling California's bureaucratic malpractice. Okay, so what does this order actually do? Well, to put it simply, it gives federal agencies like FEMA the power to basically bypass state and local building permits. So if you're using federal disaster money to rebuild your house, you wouldn't have to wait for that local approval anymore. Now, for the people who supported this, the benefits seemed pretty obvious. The order was designed to get around those 93-day permit delays. It lets licensed professionals like engineers and architects self-certify their own work. It would finally unlock $3.2 billion in SBA loans that were already approved but just sitting there. It also cut costs by getting rid of fees, and it even kicked off an audit of state funds that hadn't been spent yet. So you're thinking, faster rebuilding, less red tape. What's not to like? Well, as you can probably guess, officials in California had a very different take on it. They saw this not as a helping hand, but as a federal power grab that could actually make a really bad situation even worse. And this right here, this really gets to the core of the whole fight. On one side, you've got the White House saying local red tape is the enemy, it's malpractice, and that the feds have to step in to help people. But on the other side, you've got California saying, whoa, hold on. The real problem is a lack of federal funding, not our permits. And they framed the whole thing as a major violation of states' rights. Supporters really tried to frame this in personal terms. They called it a huge boost for victims struggling to get back on their feet. From their perspective, it was just a common sense tool to get people back into their homes, plain and simple. But Governor Gavin Newsom and other critics, they saw it very differently. They called it a political stunt and warned that getting rid of local oversight could lead to unsafe, shoddy building practices, or as they famously called it, cowboy construction. Okay, so let's step away from the political dogfight for a minute and focus on the person who is literally in the middle of all this, the homeowner. Because for them, this isn't about politics. It's a very real dilemma. Is the promise of rebuilding quickly worth the potential risks down the line? This table really lays out the tough choice they're facing. I mean, look at the benefits. A faster rebuild, lower cost up front. That's incredibly tempting. But then you look at the risks. What happens later on? Without local permit records, trying to sell or refinance your home could become a total nightmare. And if something goes wrong with the construction, the liability, the responsibility falls on you and your builder, not the government. And let's just zoom in on one of those risks, because this is a big one. Since the house would be rebuilt without those local permits, California law requires you to disclose that fact if you ever decide to sell. And that disclosure alone could knock off as much as 15% of your home's value. That is a huge financial hit. So if you're a homeowner caught in this situation, what can you actually do? Are you just stuck? Well, it turns out you're not powerless. There are some concrete steps you can take to navigate this and protect your biggest investment. All right, here's kind of the four-step playbook for protecting yourself. First, you have to become a record-keeping fanatic. Document every single federal certification, every engineer stamp. That's your proof the work was done to code. Second, don't just hire any contractor. You need to find a pro who really knows both sets of rules, federal and state. Third, get a lawyer. Seriously, a real estate attorney and an insurance expert can help you spot trouble before it becomes a massive, expensive disaster. And finally, you got to stay informed. This whole situation is constantly changing, and you need to know if any new legal challenges pop up that could affect your property.
And all of this, it really brings us to the fundamental question at the heart of this entire debate, right? When a disaster of this scale happens, who should be in the driver's seat for the recovery? Is it the state and local officials who know the community, the land, the codes? Or is it the federal government with its massive resources and power?
Now, this whole breakdown we just went through is based on some really in-depth reporting from the Shasta Beacon. We definitely encourage you to check out their work if you want to dive even deeper. So, back to our original question. Is this executive order a lifeline, or is it a risky shortcut? As we've seen, there's no easy answer. It really all depends on who you ask and what you value most, speed or long-term security. Thanks for tuning in.